Welcome to Life is Brutal. I'm Anthony. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at one of Germany's most unique and hard to define beer styles. We're going to be talking about the one and the only Zoigl beer. I believe that when people think about German beer styles, they think everything fits into perfect little tidy boxes, very clean, clear-cut examples and restrictions and guidelines of what makes styles what they are. But in my experience, I have found that not really to be the case, You have the incredibly vague and esoteric land beer. You're going to have the beer styles that are defined by where they're fermented or how they're served, like a Keller beer or a Zoigl beer. And then you have the Zoigl. Nearly impossible to define because literally every example is so incredibly different from one another. And there's a very good reason for that. So let's get into what exactly a Zoigl beer is. Zoigl, in its most simplistic definition, is an unfiltered and unpasteurized lager that has been brewed in the Oberpfalz and Upper Palatinate region of northeastern Bavaria, nestled nice and neat between the Franconian region and the Czech Republic. Zoigl beer comes in a wide range of colors from pale to dark and everything in between, and a wide range of strengths, anywhere between 5 to 7% ABV, and an even wider range of flavors. But there is some shared characteristics amongst every Zoigl offering, a shared inherent trait that you will find in all of them. And I think that's probably the best approach in order to try to define and describe Zoigl. As I mentioned, every single Zoigl beer is going to be an unfiltered, unpasteurized lager. So it is going to have the same characteristics that you would expect out of any German lager. We're talking about it being easy drinking, quite quaffable, incredibly refreshing, but also, despite the fact that it is unfiltered and unpasteurized, incredibly well made and clean cut. In comparison to other German lagers, I would say that Zoigl beer does seem to be a little bit heartier in the mouth, a little fuller than your typical Pilsner or Helles, and I think that has a lot to do with the different types of malts that are utilized in it that adds just a little bit more girth. The flavor is a bit sweeter, a bit breadier in taste than the Helles or the Pilsner, and also the hop characteristic is going to be toned down a little bit, not quite as sharp or bitter as a Pilsner. The body does have a good amount of chew to it, It's a little bit fuller, as I mentioned. I wouldn't say it's 100% full-on Voll beer or German for full beer. But, it definitely does have a little bit of a body to it. It's not quite light. It's not quite medium body. It's not full by any means. It's just kind of somewhere in between light and medium. Every Zoigl beer I've ever had has been pleasantly carbonated. Not too assertive or aggressive. Definitely not still by any means. Just pleasant to drink, easy to drink, quaffable. It's just a nice German lager. I do wish that I had a bit more to go on for the sensory characteristics and the perception of it, to kind of put harder parameters on how to define Zoigl beer, but it's just impossible. It's impossible to do a one-to-one comparison amongst themselves, and I think the one thing that truly defines it over everything else is simply its production method, how it's made. In the core essence of Zoigl, it's really nothing more than just a community brewed beer. If you were to visit the Oberpfalz regions, go through any of the little towns that are speckled throughout there that produce Zoigl, you'll usually find one central brew house in the center of town. And anybody that has the permission, the rights, or wants to brew Zoigl will go in with everyone else and they will produce a simplified wort that they will give out to everybody who wants to produce their own Zoigl. The people will then take that wort, they'll go back to their own houses, and then they'll finish brewing it there. They'll finish fermenting it there. They'll add whatever different ingredients, spices, no, not spices, Reinheitsgebot. Hey, editing Anthony from the future here. So while I was going through looking for some additional resources to add into this video, I actually stumbled across a segment on Zoigl.de, which talks about how traditional Zoigl brewers actually utilize a multitude of different spices and adjuncts into their beer to create various different effects, flavor and aroma, obviously, but also like inebriation enhancers and things like that. And it continued way closer into the modern era than I would have otherwise guessed, since the Bavarian Reinheitsgebot was instituted in like the 1500s, and like over 300 years later they were still doing that. So it's pretty crazy. I was totally wrong when I originally wrote that. So there we are. But hops, whatever that they want to do to make it customizable to their own house, they will. And that's why it's harder to describe. Town to town, they're going to be incredibly different depending on how that community wants to brew their Zoigl. And then house to house, I mean, it's insane. It's so hard. You could drink the same wort split up amongst 10 different houses, and each one of their Zoigls are going to be completely different from one another. The people of the Oberpfalz region have been brewing this way in this Zoigl method since the 1400s, maybe even earlier. That's just kind of like the earliest records we have. That's kind of why I said that Zoigl beer is largely defined and described by its production method, which is rather rustic and traditional compared to almost every other beer style in Germany. Trying to figure out more about this traditional brewing process is rather difficult, since most of the times they're not going to allow some outsider into their, community-based brewing event, right? So I tried to find like a Brewers Association of Zoigl producers or some type of official website. The closest I was able to find was zoigl.de, which is probably the closest amalgamation of Zoigl brewers and Zoigl information I was able to find, at least in the most official capacity. So let's hear what they have to say about it. To brew Zoigl, first wood is chopped. The fire started to cook the water and barley to temperature. It is cooled over copper. That is pretty insane. So wood-powered boil kettles, they're out there chopping the wood. That's what I mean when I say it's traditional. That's what I mean when I say it's rustic. You're not going to find that anywhere else in Germany, because everyone else is trying to be on that like cutting edge of what brewing can be here in Germany, technologically advanced brewing. So it's insanely cool to see this conglomeration of homebrewers essentially out there chopping wood to start fires to brew their beer. It goes on to say, the wort is distributed to the brewer's private cellars where the fermentation takes place. The method used is bottom fermenting yeast and lagering. About 2 weeks later, the beer is brought to these home pubs where it is tapped directly from the lagering tank. It is then sold in the brewer's house, which effectively becomes a pub until all the beer has been drunk. The entire Zoigl production process, all the way to the glass, is such an amazingly interesting part of these people's lives from an outsider's perspective, at least. The people with the Brauerrecht, the right to brew, they're essentially turning their entire household, their families, the entire way of life into a small tap house, that they get their beer, they finish it, and they're selling it right out the door, inviting people in, sitting on their couches, they're into their private homes and their private property, and they're like, here, drink my beer, give me money. It's insane. It's amazing. You would never see something like that happen anywhere else in Germany, let alone America. That would never happen. And because Zoigl is unpasteurized, it doesn't travel very well. So it's become hyper localized to this Oberpfalz region. You're only really going to get true authentic Zoigl by going to these people's houses and buying their beers yourself from them directly. I hope you understand what I mean now when I say it's defined by its production process, but I do think it is a little bit more than that. It's not just how it's produced, although that is a critical aspect. I think it's defined by its community. It is a community-driven event, and you just don't get the same experience in Zoigl if you are not there. So hopefully by now I've got you pretty interested in Zoigl beer. Hopefully I've got you inspired enough to go out and try to find it yourself. Get this community-based beer in the community itself. So you find yourself in Germany. You find yourself in the Oberpfalz region. All you have to do now is find a Zoigl house. But how are you going to do that? You have to look for the Zoiglstern, or the Zoigl star. Over every house with the right to brew Zoigl, you will find a 6-pointed star over their archways, signaling to the community that their beer is ready to be served. Now, I will say that having some type of symbol over your archway to let passerbys know what's going on inside the house, it's not a completely unique experience for the Zoigl, nor is it unique to the Oberpfalz region in general. In fact, all across Europe, for a variety of different services, tailors, blacksmiths, breweries, wineries, there are signs and symbols showing some type of symbolism, to let people know, hey, I see what's going on. Sometimes it's like a mashed paddle over a barrel. In this case, it's the six-pointed star. The history and concept of the Brauerstern is incredibly long and deserving of its own video, so stay tuned for next week. However, to quickly summarize, it's largely believed to be a medieval symbol of protection against fire, and is not associated with any religious or ethnic traditions, which also utilize intercrossed hexagrams. Its utilization is incredibly special and very important to all the people in Zoigl communities. If you see how close these communities are, the buildings are right next to each other, and the Zoigl house, the brewery, the community brewery where they're chopping wood and burning it inside of a house, is kind of dead center in the middle of these towns. So the risk of fire is incredibly high. I have a very interesting anecdotal experience. One of my visits to the Oberpfalz region, I was actually staying in the Puttner Brewery, and they are a Zoigl producing brewery, and I was in the middle of their town, and I was staying in their hotel, and I woke up and part of the town had burned down. I woke up and there were ambulances and fire trucks and polizei everywhere. It really freaked me out that I slept through a massive fire that burned down, I think, 2 or 3 buildings that were like right across the street from me. But luckily for me, my building was largely adorned by the Zoiglstrubel, and we were unharmed. Bit anecdotal. Maybe it made me a believer. Now's probably a good time to talk about the name, Zoigl. What is that word? What does it mean? What is it trying to tell us? Honestly, nobody really knows. It seems to have largely been lost to time. If you look at the German language, there is no word Zoigl. So where did it come from? The word Zoigl possibly stems from the German word Zeichen, meaning sign, or Zeigen, meaning show in English. In the Oberpfalz dialect, the word Zeigen is pronounced as Zoigl, which possibly was pronounced even differently in the 14th century as Zoigl. And that would make a ton of sense, since if the word Zeichen and Zeigen means sign, and Zoigl is known for its beer signs, it makes sense that it would eventually be named after the thing that it's most known for, really. The oldest evidence we have for this theory comes from a document found in the Zoigl lands from the 1500s, which does spell Zeichen as Zoigl. I think it's incredibly likely that Zoigl became Zoigl. When you look at that part of Germany, there's so many contrasting dialects going on there. It's also a crossroad between 2 different massive languages, so it's very easy to see how that word could have slowly shifted, especially when we take into consideration that region historically had been incredibly rural and there was not a high literacy rate. So as it's been written down over the centuries, it's very incredibly easy to believe that there was some type of shifted. Especially when, all in all, the Zoigl is an incredibly interesting, although complicated and hard to describe beer style, And its history and its story is not much easier. There's just been so much lost to time and so much unknown about it. But I will say it has created a bit of a mystique around it, a interest and intrigue, because people are fascinated by its concept, that whole community-driven, hyper-regionally exclusive thing. So it has made a bit of a name for itself. Again, not a widespread name. I think there's probably plenty of beer-consuming Germans, even in Bavaria, who had never even heard of a Zoigl, let alone, far beyond its borders. But I really do hope it does pick up a little bit, because, it's the most traditional beer style, that is a legacy to behold, centuries of tradition still in the modern era. Unfortunately, that legacy is at risk of being tarnished because there are a lot of massive regional breweries in the Overfalls region and even some smaller brands that are attempting to bite off the Zoigl name. They're trying to take its good community driven, heartwarming essence and they're trying to corporatize it and profit off of it. In fact, I don't know if any one of these beers that I have here, all Zoigls, I don't know if any of them are like authentic community driven Zoigls. Possibly the Putner Brow. That one, Schlammendorf is a small town, central brewery, but I didn't see any other Zoigl signs throughout the town, so I don't know what the community aspect of it is. So why would breweries want to capitalize on such an obscure beer style, right? Why would a brewery like Monkshof, a brewery that produces insanely large amounts of beer, you can find it all over Germany, you can find it in the States being distributed, so why would they want to capitalize on such a esoteric and eccentric little beer style? Well, I think it largely has to do with us, the consumers, people who are interested in this video in particular. As the craft beer scene has continued to evolve and grow, we have become a bit more interested and excited about lesser known beer styles, and the harder and more esoteric and obscure they are, the more interest it seems to garner. Oberpfalz has seen a significant increase in beer tourism for people coming to hunt down the Zoigl. Now, a drastic increase is a relative term. I was still seen as like some type of three-headed outsider while I was stomping through hunting this beer down. But regardless, people have started to understand and look for and try to find the Zoigl a bit more. And since it's so hard to get to it and it's so hard to find it at the right time, because as soon as the individual sellers run out, they're done, they're done for the season. So there's a vacuum and someone needs to fill that vacuum, and it's going to be large industrial brewers pumping out beers, slapping the name Zoigl on it, maybe some iconography, and pushing it out to the masses, completely losing that community-based aspect, the heart and soul of Zoigl. Now, I will admit, I'm a little bit torn on this, On one hand, I would say I really don't like the fact that they are stripping a beer style of its core identity, of its essence, for profit or capitalization or whatever. But on the other hand, it is opening up the style to many more drinkers who would never have gotten the chance to try it. For example, I have been to the Overfalls region on 3 separate occasions. I have stayed there for over weeks, weeks and weeks. And I have been actively and aggressively hunting down Zoigl beer. The same aggression and vigor as I do for all of my beer style videos. And if you've been watching me for any amount of time, you know that's a significant amount of work I put into trying to hunt down a single beer style. But I've only ever gotten to find one authentic Zoigl offering in my entire hunt. In 5 years, one authentic in-house Zoigl. And I'll say that as I've drank through these different Zoigl offerings, they do live up to that one true in-house authentic Zoigl that I did have. So I'm torn. I hate that it strips it, but I would not be able to sit here and drink Zoigl beer, and probably neither would countless other people if these breweries weren't pumping them out in large quantities. So is Zoigl truly defined by that community-based essence, or is that just a traditional aspect of the style? If they're able to replicate the flavors, fine-tuned a little bit, sure, definitely not as rustic, but if it's still the same flavor, sensory characteristics, maybe not the same experience of sitting in a stranger's house, but is it still Zoigl? I don't know. To make matters worse, there used to be hundreds of houses all across the region, in all the different towns and cities that had the right to brew Zoigl beer, and, they would. But in the modern era, there's only 5 towns that still produce traditional Zoigl. And some of these towns don't have a single active Zoigl brewer. No Zoigl being sold in a historic traditional Zoigl town. It's incredibly easy to say that it is on a decline. That traditional rustic aspect is fading away, giving way to other beer styles. When I was in town, it was so easy for me to find Pilsners and Helleses and Hefeweizens, but I had to leave the town to find these commercialized examples of Zoigl. It's entirely possible that eventually this might be the only Zoigl left. And if it's the only Zoigl people really get to try, does that then become the new identity, the new essence of Zoigl? It's heartbreaking in a way, you know. It's weird seeing a beer style in its dying star phase, in an extinction event, essentially. Especially while there's still some lingering phantom, some ghosts still actively trying to keep the traditions alive. We're in a new era, and Zoigl will have to adapt. It'll have to change. Whether we accept those changes, that's for everyone to decide on their own. But for me, I'm torn. Whew, I wasn't expecting to get that deep. that got weirdly philosophical there at the end. But when you're dealing with incredibly vague beer styles and you've had a few, that kind of happens. So I hope you learned something, at least had your thoughts provoked by this conversation on Zoigl. Tell me, what do you think? Because, man, it's incredibly fascinating. Can a beer style be solely defined by the concept of brewing with your fellow people in your community? Is that something that can be regulated, controlled, defined? You know? I'm just interested to know what you think, because obviously I'm scatterbrained on this. Most importantly, I hope you get the opportunity to try Zoigl one day in the future. It's an amazing experience, and it's a great tasting beer. So, you know, best of luck in all your hunts. So, thanks for watching. Remember, there is a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.